uncertainty and follow political goals. Historians say they are objective, but they are seldom objective. Just like the U.S. Supreme Court. It always says, it's objective. And just not long ago, John, what is that Supreme Court justice's name?
Roberts.
He said, we're not Republican judges, we're not Democratic judges, we are Supreme Court judges. We don't take sides, we are not partisan. But there's an old adage that the Supreme Court follows the election returns. And they do a bit. And historians follow election returns. Historians ride on coattails. They pretend to be objective, but they aren't. You can't really be purely objective as a historian because you have your own personal feelings, your own personal backgrounds, and your own memories from youth. And so Carl Becker, who taught at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York for many years, wrote a famous essay. And I would urge everybody who's interested in history as a discipline to read Carl Becker's Every Man His Own Historian. Becker was a very boring teacher, very boring lecturer, but he was a brilliant writer and an exciting writer. And so he wrote this essay, Every Man His Own Historian. Everyone must find his own set of causes for the Civil War. You have to be your own historian. And I would urge you to read that essay and think about some of the big issues in history, like the causes of the Civil War, some of the other issues that we have had recently. History reflects public opinion. If you go to Alabama, Kentucky, or Maine, what do you say to people that you meet when they ask you where you're from? And you say, I'm from Southeast Missouri. I did that once in a restaurant in Maine. The person said, you're from Southeast Missouri? Aren't they just a bunch of rabble-rousers, rebels, and thieves down there? I said, no, not necessarily. I met a lot of people with a lot of different opinions everywhere. Everyone across the country has different opinions. But everyone is from somewhere. And if you're from Bloomfield, Missouri, or Southeast Missouri, what do you believe is the cause of the Civil War, which killed 700,000 and going up? Maybe 6 million horses. 6 million horses died in the Civil War. Did anyone ever treat a wound on a horse? How did they bury horses? How do you bury a horse? We did that on our farm one time. A horse that we'd had a long time died. I was so sad, I cried and cried and cried. And then when I saw how they buried a horse, I cried even more. Not an easy task. What did they do with the dead horses in the Civil War? If there's 6 million dead horses, how do you get rid of them? So there's a lot of gruesome scenes and emotions in that war. 700,000 people died an early death. Think of all the people who died of really difficult diseases. It was a very tough time. Important to recognize that we have gone through several phases of trying to figure out what caused the Civil War, because it's one of the great questions of American history. What caused the Civil War? If we could understand clearly, certainly, what causes a war, we would understand much about ourselves and about our society, about democracy. Because civil war is about democracy, isn't it? Majority, minority. The fundamental issues of democracy are invested in the Civil War. We have to understand them. And during the war itself, there were people, historians, writing histories of what caused the war while the war was still going on. They knew somebody would ask this at the end. So 2 books, including Horace Greeley's book, The American Conflict, was the first book to reach an analysis of what caused the war. And he believed that it was the power held by the Confederate States. And they posed a challenge to governmental administration by the Union. Published that book in 1864, before the war was over. He had already written a book about the cause of the Civil War. Second significant book written after the war, or during the war, was John Logan's book. And where's John Logan from?
Southern Illinois.
Murfreesboro, Illinois, just across the river. He's a neighbor of ours. John Logan wrote a book entitled The Great Conspiracy. The Great Conspiracy. He believed it was the pro-slave majority, or a pro-slave conspiracy of Southerners who supported a plot. It was really a conspiracy. It was very negative. And he was embarrassed. But they're both Union views, Northern views. They both published these, and they sold by hundreds of thousands of copies. You can still find them around. You can still find John Logan's. You can still find Horace Greeley's book. I have two copies of both of those. But in the South, now everybody during a war, everyone during a war writes a biased history. Everyone writes about their view while the war is going on. So you have to wait kind of till after the war to understand the overall perspective. For instance, in the South, there were 2 people who wrote books at the same time that Greeley and Logan did. And they wrote pro-Southern, pro-Confederate interpretations. One of those was George Lunt, L-U-N-T. Now, George Lunt wrote a book entitled Origins of the Late War, published in 1866. And he was very negative about Jefferson Davis. He was critical of Jefferson Davis, but very supportive of the South and of pro-slavery. The other person who published a book at the same time is very famous. That is Edward Pollard, who wrote a book entitled, in 1866, The Lost Cause. The Lost Cause. He says the South had tried to live up to its obligations for all of its existence since colonial times, and the South had always been denied. And so the South tried to hold their power, their strength in the Union, and they had to turn to war. Edward Pollard was a world traveler. He had spent a lot of time in Nicaragua. He wanted to add Nicaragua to the United States as a southern state. He was born in 1820, but he died in 1830, but he died in 1870. He died at age 40. So he's a very young man. He is the guy who started the lost cause argument that prevails in a lot of people today. It recirculates on a regular time. So you have different views by participants. All four of those men in some way or other participated in the war, had definite views, and wrote about those views. And their books sold by the hundreds of thousands. In the late 1800s, there were other views, of course, basically called constitutional interpretations. Two of them were by Jefferson Davis and Alexander Stephens. They both wrote books about the causes of the war. And they both argued that slavery was only the incident. It was a political struggle, and that the South could only defend itself by turning to war. And the South forced the issue. Goes back to 1787, they argued. It should have been dealt with at the Constitutional Convention. They should have written slavery into the Constitution by name. The word slave is not in the U.S. Constitution. Secession is not there. They should have had a provision for secession. Would that have been a good idea? If you enter voluntarily, you should be able to leave voluntarily. They talked about it, but not really directly, because there already had been discussions of inequality between North and South. So Stephens and Davis were both in that group of people who wrote about the pro-Southern position. Then, also around the turn of the century, is John W. Burgess, who's from Tennessee, but fought in the Union Army during the war, and a lot of people from Tennessee did. He began his academic career by going to Germany and studying with some of the great German historians. And German historians were always the world's best in the 1700s and 1800s and early 1900s. And so Burgess went to Germany, had the best universities in the world at the time, and he then came back to the United States and got a job at the best university in America, which was not Harvard at the time, but was Columbia University in New York City. If you ever go to New York City, go to the campus of Columbia University. It was the greatest university in the world in the 1800s. Burgess became a professor of political science at Columbia University, and he accepted the Supreme Court, John Marshall, the political institutions of America. He saw that the Civil War, in his mind, was a fight for American existence. That the soldiers from the North and the South were fighting on battlefields, but they were actually fighting for the existence of America. It's the Civil War and the Constitution that you're trying to save. And John Burgess became a great political scientist, probably the most famous political scientist in the world for a period of time around the turn of the century. Then in the 1890s and early 1900s, there are other people who have differing views, seeking the same answer. What was the cause of the Civil War? They include people who are looking at the great national picture. So they're often called the nationalist school of Civil War historians. And they include a young man named James Ford Rhodes. James Ford Rhodes was a brother of Mark Hanna. Mark Hanna is a great political boss in the 19th century. He was his brother-in-law. And he became a steel magnate, an executive with steel companies, and he had a few $1 million and he had a vision of what he could do. He wanted to be a historian. As a strange thought today, he wanted to be a historian. So he moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts, just west of Boston. And he bought a house. He had enough money to buy a really nice house. Had a big library. And he walked every day to the Harvard Library and smoked a pipe. He did everything that would make him feel like a professional historian. And he worked there for 30-some years, every day, the Harvard Library. And he wrote 8 volumes, 600 pages each. He wrote 5,000 pages about what caused the Civil War. So if you want to read a thorough examination, read James Ford Rhodes' 5,000 pages of what caused the Civil War. It's a history of America, all leading to the grand climax of the Civil War. He had to write a volume at the end talking about Reconstruction, and it's not very good. The first 7 are really pretty good. But he was just lampooned by historians, criticized, laughed at by historians. He said the North was right in assuming that slavery had to go. But the South was not wrong on the issue of slavery. You got to think about that a bit. James Ford Rhodes, 8 volumes, 4,000 pages of what caused the Civil War. He said this is the American question. And it will always be the American question, he said, because we're talking about democracy. He became very popular, but then just sort of fizzled out. He just disintegrated. And you don't see many copies of his books now. And you never hear anything about Rhodes. The next phase, I'm taking you through the different phases of interpretation, and I'm going to take you up to recent times, if I can, if you endure all of this. The next theory, the next cluster of historians are what are called economic determinists by people in the field, and they include Charles and Mary Beard. If you've studied much history, you have seen Charles and Mary Beard, husband and wife team. And they were joined by Lewis Hacker, who was at Columbia, who was a Marxist. He's the first really prominent Marxist historian in America. So Charles and Mary Beard and Lewis Hacker, around the turn of the century, become economic historians and believe that the Civil War was caused by economic issues. Certainly Hacker would. He's a Marxist. Marxists are always guilty of believing that everything is caused by economics. So you tell a Marxist, you know, this situation exists, what do you think caused that? And they'll say economics, because economics causes everything. One factor fallacy, kind of. It's not always one thing, but to an economist, to a Marxist, they might be. Very popular for a long time. And the Beards became a working team, and they argued that economic forces in history is what really counts and what shapes people's lives. The kind of economy that we live in. Kind of soil, kind of crop you raise, kind of animals you raise. All of those are economic issues, and they are shaped by the soil and the land and the system of labor. And so all of those economic determinists believe that everything is economic. They dominate around 1900, the 1890s to the 1920s. And there are some economic historians, Beardian historians, who are still around, who still believe that the economy shapes everything. Then in the Depression and World War II, something's going to happen. The Depression is so big, World War II is so big, that virtually everything came under historians' analysis. Well, we just made a mistake. It's not economic. It's the South that caused the Civil War. Southern revisionism became a powerful force, and that included three historians who you probably need to hear about if you ever look at American history. One of those is James Garfield Randall, who was a distinguished professor of history at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana. There was Avery Craven at Chicago. There was Frank Owsley at Vanderbilt. And these three guys all kind of emerged at the same time. And they all began to re-examine the South. And this is the time period in which Confederate historians or Southern historians kind of come back to the fore. I met James Garfield Randall on one occasion. He married a woman from Virginia. Avery Craven married the daughter of a plantation owner in Georgia. Frank Owsley married a woman from Tennessee. Now, I don't know if you believe wives have an impact on their husbands or not, but I think in these three cases they may have. Because these three women were all powerful individuals, all historians in their own right. And Ruth Painter Randall wrote a whole series of books about Abraham Lincoln. She was a fine historian. They all say we need to re-examine the role of the South in this. And we need to look at the role of the South in a more thorough and appropriate way. So they're revisionist historians. They see different reasons for the war. They argue, Randall argues, that that Southern agitation pushed the North beyond reasonable limits. And Abraham Lincoln then, who was a product of this, said, we have tried compromise, and there were lots of efforts to compromise, but he said, we cannot get the South to do that. They will not compromise. They're rigid. They're taking a position from which we cannot negotiate. And Randall came up with a clever theory that the cause of the Civil War, now they're writing in the 1920s, 30s, when Hitler's coming to power. And they are saying, as Randall said most clearly, I believe, that the leaders of American politics at this time period became a blundering generation, North and South. They just all blundered into it. They were young. They were on the make. They were evolving politically. And they were looking for fame and looking for power and looking for positions. So they wanted to do something, to argue something that would get them publicity. Randall said, that political blundering moved the world into World War II. And he mentioned people like Neville Chamberlain, who went to Berlin and smoked his pipe and gave press conferences and then made concessions to Adolf Hitler. Someone said, did the South do that? Did the North do that? Do people blunder into things? And Randall argued, it was very powerful, that the blundering generation, Stephen Douglas is one of those, blundered us into war. It was young Northerners and young Southerners who agitated and blundered us into the worst civil war in history. Killed 700,000. To us, that was ghastly. We always overlooked the fact that while the American Civil War was going on, the Taiping Rebellion was going on in China, which may have killed 25 million people. It dwarfs the American Civil War by numbers. Take a look just for fun sometime on the internet at the Taiping Rebellion, going on while the Civil War's going on. We had 700,000 dead, both sides. Taiping Rebellion, 25 million, can that be true? I don't know. There have been a lot of challenges, of course, to the Southern revisionists. And one of them was Arthur Schlesinger Jr. Some of you may know Arthur Schlesinger's name. Written lots of stuff. The Age of Jackson, he wrote. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. was the highest paid faculty member in the United States. I read an article one time about him. I was a historian at SEMO. And I looked at my salary, and I looked at his salary, and I said, wow, why am I not at Columbia University or CUNY, City University of New York? He got a salary of $250,000 a year in the 1970s. Now, that's not royalty from books, that's salary, and he didn't have to teach any courses. I said, how do you get a deal like that? Arthur Schlesinger Jr. was a marvelous writer. I think he was wrong on a lot of the stuff he wrote, but he was a great writer. He attacked James Garfield Randall vigorously. He said, for instance, in the aftermath of World War II, if you're saying to me that America blundered into the Civil War and we just had World War II, did we blunder into that one? Is there a blunder factor that causes all wars? If we blundered into the Civil War, Professor Randall, he just excoriated Randall. Randall hated the Nazis, and he hated the leadership of American politics prior to Franklin Roosevelt. So Schlesinger said, show us where they blundered. Tell us exactly where the blunder was, so we can't repeat it. Where did we blunder in World War II? Going into it. So there was a great debate about that, and the three historians who emerged, and there's sort of the trio like those three who emerged from the South. Dwight Dumont at the University of Michigan. The University of Michigan always has great historians. They don't pay as much as the University of Illinois does, but the historians always produce more books. And the people in Illinois scratch their heads and say, how do we get those people here? Michigan historians always are top notch. They always emerge. You hire them young and then give them the independence and let them go. Illinois doesn't do that. Dwight Dumont at Michigan and John Hope Franklin, first great black historian, who is at the University of Chicago. So there's Champaign and Chicago. And then Carter Woodson, who started the Journal of Southern History and Black History Month. Those three emerged, and they developed a new emphasis in the Civil War causes by saying a lot of African Americans believed it was civil rights, that blacks were fighting for their rights, and they pushed the issue. The abolitionists, for instance, the state historians in various states such as Kentucky and Tennessee and Georgia, even Southern historians. So the argument was that it's really an anti-slavery movement that pushed the nation over the edge. And they were doing that for the right reasons. They were seeking to improve their lot in history. And so they moved toward a new African American civil rights history. Now that's going to be in the 1950s, 60s, and early 70s. John Hope Franklin, who lived to be, I think, 92, published the book about African American history in the United States, and it's a classic, and it went through, I think, 17 editions or something like that. Then in that whole era of civil rights did not last long. It was a brief spurt, drew a lot of people, drew a lot of young graduate students who would later go on and become historians in various places. They were eager, and they thought they were fighting for the rights of African Americans. And so places like Michigan and Chicago, Vanderbilt, became places where black students, graduate students, had fame and success. The University of Pittsburgh was one of the first. The University of Pittsburgh had a department chairman who was born in the hog pen school at Lehman, Missouri. He grew up in Lehman, Missouri, just north of Cape Girardeau, in the suburbs of Cape Girardeau, the metroplex of Cape Girardeau. And this young man, John William Oliver, became chairman of the Department of History at the University of Pittsburgh. The University of Pittsburgh is in one story, 42 stories tall. Everything but the football field is in the building. John W. Oliver had an office on the 42nd floor, and he could look down and see the Monongahela and, what's that other river? It comes together. The Allegheny. He could look down and see the Golden Triangle. And he came up with the plan. We ought to do something with that. And he also became the first chairman of a Department of History that got a chunk of money to recruit black graduate students in history. And when I was in the Department of History at SEMO, someone suggested to us we ought to have an African American historian in the department. I thought that was a good idea. I became chairman of the department for a few years, and so we tried hard. We couldn't get anyone to come to Cape Girardeau. Any black American to come to Cape Girardeau and be a member of the Department of History. They could get more money at Pittsburgh or anywhere. Everybody was looking for a black historian. We interviewed some, but they all took jobs elsewhere. So they came and practiced their interviews and then went on. We never could attract anyone. Early in the mid 20th century, 50s, late 50s, 60s, and 70s, there was another school that emerged to try and answer that same question: what caused the Civil War? And that included the romanticists, the people who are individuals who believe that there was something really romantic about the Civil War, the romance of it. That included individuals like Bruce Catton. If you've ever read Bruce Catton, Stillness at Appomattox, Grant Moves South, is very romantic. And every paragraph is very well written because Bruce Catton was a journalist. He had written for several newspapers. He is the most colorful individual. He is a combination of skills. Brilliant, brilliant writer. Born in a little town called Petoskey, Michigan, and Michigan educated. He says the Civil War was bigger than anyone realizes in America. He said the Civil War is so big that it is world significant. That what happened here was significant for the whole theory of democracy, for American nationalism. It is a very big thing. And so Bruce Catton makes everything out to be really monumental and written very clearly. If the soldiers thought it was a romantic voyage or trip they were on, I don't think they realized it, but the writers did. And so there's a whole wave of them. So Bruce Catton started American Heritage magazine. Lots of colorful pictures. And he became the editor for a very long time. The History Book Club started at this time. And what was their favorite topic to publish books on? The Civil War. Every book on the Civil War sold out. So the History Book Club put the Civil War on everybody's desk and everybody's bookshelf. And Bruce Catton was responsible for that. In the 1960s and 70s, there was a different view. We go back to kind of contemporary views. And some of the writers at this time, for instance, Michael Holt wrote The Political Crisis of the 1850s. And he said the major cause of the Civil War was political disintegration. Our politics fell apart. There were no leaders. It was a catastrophe. And it was complex. Historians now sort of say, if they're asked, what's the cause of this and there? Well, it was a really combination of things. No one wants a single cause, so it's a combination that's very complex. Eugene Genovese emerged. Genovese is a Marxist. He was at the University of Rochester. The University of Rochester, where Eastham Kodak is, University of Rochester became kind of the Marxist University of America. Eugene Genovese, when no one was looking, became the chairman of the Department of History. And he recruited all Marxists to the department. So it was called the Marxist School of History. Genovese looked at everything, and he began to say it was a cultural thing. He studied all of the church records he could find. He found even the churches were hopelessly divided, unable to reconcile. And if the churches can't reconcile, how can families reconcile? And if families cannot reconcile, then how is society going to reconcile? So he said America broke apart because our philosophy failed, our way of life failed, and we could not manage this. Recently, in recent times, James McPherson has emerged as probably the leading American Civil War historian. James McPherson has written a wide variety of books. Some of his books are just classics. There's not a bad sentence in some of his books. He is a brilliant writer. He was at Princeton. And Princeton is a great place to be. I always thought that would be a dream job. So I went and walked around a while, and I could walk by the windows of the private clubs and hear the silverware and the china clinking and piano music playing in the evening meal time. It's pretty ritzy. And faculty members don't have to teach if they don't want to. If you come up and you have an idea, and you have 3 classes scheduled for a semester, and you go in and tell your chairman, I don't think I want to teach this semester. Just like, okay, what are you working on? That's fine. And they could just do it. So it's the life of Riley, sort of. James McPherson at Princeton wrote a number of books about the Civil War, and the best single volume book on the Civil War. And in it he says, the Civil War cause is a human failure cause. It's a humanity thing. Human beings have failed to understand and to put this in perspective. Alan Guelzo, Guelzo. Alan Guelzo is now at Princeton, replacing McPherson. Guelzo, a great big tall guy who writes about religion, and he says it's a religious divide. It's penetrated every church. It touches our morals. That's why the Civil War occurred. It was a religious and moral failure. Harold Holzer wrote, Lincoln and the Power of the Press. He won the Lincoln Prize. There is now about 10,000 books about Abraham Lincoln. He is the second most written about human being in history. Christ is number 1. Lincoln is number 2. He's only been dead 155 years. And there are 2 prizes for the best article or the best book on Abraham Lincoln each year, $50,000. So there are 2 people each year getting $50,000 for writing something on Lincoln. You tell a historian there's $50,000 out there, and they're going to pump out some books. And they have. There are over maybe 10,000 books. And they're just all over the place. You can go to Kent Library at SEMO and see a book entitled, Why Lincoln Hated Women. Right beside it is a book entitled, The Women Lincoln Loved. And someone said, everything about Lincoln has been written, except Lincoln's doctor's dog. But all of those books now indicate that we are looking at civil rights again. We're looking at racial issues. And if they're human issues, like McPherson says, then the cause of the Civil War was really a human cause. People overlooked the human distinctions that took place at that time. It's the failure of the slaveholders. It's the failure of the politicians in the North. It's the failure of Congress. And everybody blames Congress. And they certainly at times look like they deserve some blame. But they blame Congress, they blame human failure, they blame the inability to compromise, they blame not understanding what African Americans are trying to do. David Blight just won the Lincoln Prize, 75. He's won the Lincoln Prize 3 times. He's got $50,000 on 3 occasions. Now how do I write a book like that? And the answer is, I wish I knew. Wish I knew. But David Blight has wrote a biography of Frederick Douglass, one of the great figures of American history that most white Americans don't know. Frederick Douglass was in your face. He pushed the issues. He published a black newspaper. He would go anywhere and do anything to help someone who was poor and despondent. David Blight has written this 800-page book, won the Pulitzer Prize and the Lincoln Prize, so he's won a chunk of money from writing. Because there's an audience out there that wants to read this. There are a lot of people out there who want to understand the causes of the Civil War, because if we do, we understand America. Those are kind of the dominant theories behind the causes of the Civil War. I want to turn now and see if you heard any of those and you think you have an answer as to why the Civil War occurred. Is there a clear-cut answer? 155 years in the making. We're no closer to a resolution of that than we were in 1865. And many of these writers have said this is the question that haunts America. And 700,000 people died. What a terrible price. That's both sides, but that's still a lot of human beings. And how many were wounded? How many injured? How many had an amputation? 1/6 of the Mississippi budget in 1866 was for artificial limbs. 1/6 of the total state budget in Mississippi was for artificial arms or legs. How painful must it have been to have an amputation? People will do anything to relieve pain. If you've ever had intense pain, you know you will do anything to relieve it. And so morphine was developed in 1832, became widely used. Doctors still didn't know about germs, so doctors would walk among the beds of the injured with morphine powder in the palm of their hands and let soldiers lick the powder out of their hand. Have you ever seen a movie of World War II? You'll see soldiers say, "Give me morphine, give me morphine." It's the best, one of the best quick and easy solutions for the relief of pain. But it's very addictive. And so morphinism is still known as the soldier's disease from the Civil War. There was so much of it issued, mounds of it issued. No one understood about germs. Isn't it difficult to imagine life without the knowledge of germs? My father was born in 1888. He never believed in germs. I told him, once I looked through a microscope, I said, "Oh my gosh, all that stuff is there?" I told my father, and he said, "I don't believe that stuff. You can't see it, it's not there." So he never believed in germs. He would get a terrible cold, and I would say, "You got some germs, Father?" "Yeah, get out of here." So what do you think of all of those scholars who spent their lives working on this topic, what caused the Civil War? Which topic do you think best answers that? Should we ask Jim Mayo again? Anyone have an answer that you'd like to volunteer? What caused the Civil War? 155 years we've been thinking on this, working on this, researching it, and we still don't have an answer. Anyone here have a clear-cut answer in your mind? And don't be bashful. There is no wrong answer. Every man his own historian, said Carl Becker. So,
I'd like to offer one.
okay, offer one.
I'm no Marxist, first of all. Economics did play a large factor in the form of tariffs. The South was paying 80% of the nation's taxes through import tariffs, and the majority of that money was going to Northern public works projects. That being said, I think a lot of the cause depends on where you lived. Missourians, a lot of them want it to remain neutral, but depending on what you call it, Southerners call it St. Louis Massacre, Northerners call it the Camp Jackson incident. These people saw native-born Missourians being marched through the streets of St. Louis at gunpoint by German-born officers. That is what got a lot of Missourians off the fence.
Yes.
So, I think tariffs and just where you lived, and depending on what the situation was where you lived.
The imbalance of tariffs,
Yes.
the tariff of abominations, they called it. That was the source of land sales, and tariffs were the source of income for the U.S. government in the first half of the 19th century. So you certainly can make an economic argument, and there are a lot of people who've done that. Economics are out of popularity now because we don't see that much difference between North and South. Because people, we're moving everywhere, and so people from Montgomery, Alabama now live in Huron, Michigan. That's strange. Wouldn't have happened in the 19th century much. So is economics still the big cause?
Luckily, we don't have tariffs now.
Okay. We are lucky we don't have
I think it was
and we're still arguing over tariffs. We will always argue over tariffs.
I think it was monetary, and slavery has developed into an excuse. And
Slavery is an excuse.
because West Virginia was admitted to the Union as a slave state.
Yeah.
To our during the war.
No, they created it.
I know
Abraham Lincoln went into the 1864 election convinced he was going to lose. He would not have enough electoral votes. So they created a state out of Nevada when there was no one who lived in Nevada. So they would get 3 more electoral votes. And the first senator from Nevada lived in San Francisco. I married a girl from Cape Girardeau, Missouri. But there were no clear-cut answers to those 3 states. Lincoln really didn't need those 3 states. He could have won without West Virginia. He could have won without Nevada. And what was the third one? I don't remember now. They created those states at any rate. So in some arguments, people in Virginia say, well, there's no reason for West Virginia, you know. And some people in California say, there's no reason for Nevada. It should be something else. But they created new states so Lincoln would have more electoral votes. Lincoln was a tough politician. He didn't hesitate to bend the rules to do whatever he had to do to win. Every president who runs for re-election wants to win. And Lincoln was one of those. He even went to the point of creating new states to do that. That's a pretty bold act. Think about it. And there weren't enough people in Nevada to justify a state. West Virginia and Virginia had distinct differences in policies. So economic issues we've heard. What's another one? Yes, sir.
In the states' rights,
States' rights.
which
How do you make the argument for states' rights? In a democracy, it's pretty easy. It's a democracy. It's a balance of majority, minority. Minority rights. How do you protect minority rights? Alexa de Tocqueville wrote a great book, Democracy in America. Published it in 1831. Best analysis of strengths and weaknesses of democracy ever put in one book. And he said that imbalance in a majority-minority will be the great undoing of America. I just read an article in the Wall Street Journal last week in which some guy's predicting the United States may fall into another civil war. And we dislike each other so much now on issues that we may eventually work ourselves, blunder our way into another civil war. His argument of abortion, for instance, we can't resolve abortion. We can't resolve a lot of issues. And so his argument is we're on the path, and he used the Civil War to examine and compare that. We're on the path to another civil war. That's scary, pretty scary stuff. I don't know if there's a lot to support that, but it's scary to think about. I don't know. You know what to do about gun rights. And the former Supreme Court Justice just suggested not long ago, we need to revise the Second Amendment. If you go out to the public and say you're going to revise the Second Amendment, what are you going to get?
another civil war.
Civil War. But people are not going to stand for that. People in Stoddard County or Scott County will just jump and yell if you say you're going to change the Second Amendment. This guy, the former U.S. Supreme Court Justice, said this may be the only answer to that issue. So the issues that we faced in 1861 are in some ways still with us. Imbalance between majority and minority. Issues over race, we haven't solved that yet. Issues over federal government versus state government. I think those are all issues that remain with us and are really powerful. And we need to probably pay more attention to them. And think about the nature of democracy. What does democracy mean to us? Other questions or comments?
Just to make a comment, my wife's working on a biography of a lady who was the author of the first charity cookbook, and it was donated to the Philadelphia Sanitary Fairs. And so in the process of that research, we uncovered letters that she wrote at the beginning of the Civil War. She had a brother that was living in San Francisco, kind of part of the gold rush movement. San Francisco, very prominent person, and sort of managed the investments. And so it's interesting to read her, because she was a very well-educated lady, attended the opera very much in society in Philadelphia, and her observations and the things that she wrote about that were happening at that time. And particularly the beginning of her letters, her biggest concern was what's going to happen to our investments. They had gas company and various investments, and she was unmarried, lived with two of her sisters, all unmarried. They'd come from a family that was very wealthy, shipping merchant family, and so she was really concerned what she expressed in these letters about their investments, what's going to happen. And a little later, she becomes concerned over the issue of secession, that she talks about those terrible secessionists. So it's just interesting that this is someone that was writing at that time as she was observing, and you know, it's obvious that she read the newspapers and was very well informed. So interesting to read those sorts of things.
The whole issue of secession
Yeah.
is an interesting one,
Yeah.
which they never included in the Constitution. Is that a mistake? Should there have been a provision for secession? If you come into the Union and you find out it's not very good, like a divorce, something's gone wrong here, can we legally separate? Boy, they beat that one to death in the 19th century. That's a tough one. That's a real tough one.
Well, I don't think that the founding fathers would agree with that, because they was, the whiskey rebellion. George Washington sent, troops in there in order to keep from secession. And he was obviously a founding father, so
Right.
they couldn't allow secession to come and go as you wanted to.
Okay. Interesting point.
Well, during this state right issue, I mean, after several incidents that tell us that that's an underlying, I mean, when Robert E. Lee's offered command of all the forces of the Union, and he says, well, I think my home state of Virginia is gonna succeed, and I'm gonna go with my home state. And when they're laying out the cemetery at Gettysburg, there's quite a fight over, we want Massachusetts soldiers here, and we want New York soldiers here. They don't want any intermingling. I mean, in which it all comes to economics, and
Okay.
Somebody from the state of South Carolina doesn't want somebody in Washington D.C. telling them what to do.
Yeah.
And I look at it like this, and maybe wrongly so, and I'd like to finish this point. I'm a farmer. Artie's a farmer. And you think about, if somebody said, well, we're gonna outlaw tractors and combines, and my livelihood is agriculture. That's an economic, right? And so, you start talking about taking away my livelihood,
And the biggest transfer of property in American history was the ending of slavery. You had 4 million persons who had dollar value, and you just automatically end that. Has somebody lost some money? Big time.
But that was tolerated and was a point that maybe not well liked by the North, but was willing to be compromised until the middle of the war, and it became a tool to help shorten the war. Because if we destabilized the South by telling the slaves they were free, we could take away the economic power and also reinforce our forces. Because we were starting to get short on soldiers from the North, is my understanding, not terribly short, right? But this was a way to quickly fill the ranks easily without paying a penalty from the North.
Right. Go back and take a look at the Crittenden Compromise right before the war and see what the South was willing to compromise. There were many efforts to compromise. Crittenden Compromise was one of the closest to that. Would have been the 13th Amendment if it had passed.
But to this fellow's point, I think it's true that, and somebody brought up the tariffs and the economics early on, and the imbalance of that. And to me, there's the economics their states' rights, and then it's how the religious sects early settled in to the different parts of the country, because in the farther north you went, you had folks like Quakers and others, all right, that had a different mentality about, and so they had stronger views. In fact, as you came up into the New England states, that's where the agitation was so unwilling to compromise with the southern states.
Right.
So I think those factors together combine themselves into where it becomes.
Okay, that's very good.
Yes, sir. I'd like to make a point about secession, and I've pondered this, probably like everybody else has, but I always go back to the founding of this country myself, and I have a little different take on it. How was this country founded? We seceded from England. So our country was born of secession. So it's only natural to believe if you enter into a compact voluntarily, like you said, and there's no other recourse, then try to leave peacefully. So I believe maybe it didn't need to be defined because that's how the nation was founded. We didn't ask King George if we could leave. We left.
We forced the issue, for sure. An interesting point. Lots of discussion on that one.
There's one thing about, I thought, I read a thing about, some of the people Lincoln had in his cabinet. He had some pretty smart people in his cabinet.
You did?
One person he really butted heads with, because he was a lawyer, is Robert Stanton. And Robert Stanton was the Secretary of War. And at the end of the war, I read this from an article, that Lincoln told Stanton, because Stanton was wanting to retire out, and he wanted him to stay on. He said, I know you can get, he was talking about the rebuilding of the South, and he he said, I know you can do it. And so he finished on even after Lincoln's assassination, and he went through 68, and in 69 he got elected to the Supreme Court, but he only served 1 week because he died the next week.
Yes.
And so there's a lot of plans that's made, but they just get derailed, and he planned it, but there's so many different other things that just, you can plan the best school best you can, and you just don't know what'll happen as far as that.
Life is uncertain and full of surprises, as we all find out, We've all had.
And like Lincoln said, a house divided against itself cannot stand.
Right.
So if a country does not stand, we'd be like some European countries that one section wants this, another section wants this, and it's just chaos. So I think it's just like, born of immigration. They immigrated from one place because they wanted religious freedom, and they came over here, and then it all came together, but they had to get the people together, because like the Articles of Confederation, and that didn't work, so they had to get another thing, get them all together. Otherwise, they would have never stood, and all that.
Very true. You are an interesting group, and a bright and experienced group. I appreciate your comments. If you have further questions or suggestions, maybe Jim Mayo will have other programs here. I didn't realize there were that many people who would be interested in the causes of the Civil War. I appreciate your presence here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
1 minute. Frank, you let me talk.
We better let him talk, okay? Okay, now's your time, Jim.
Okay, I'm gonna be short. All of this, all the things that have been said here are true, and we fail to see each other's side. It's just natural. It's just natural. I do not particularly care to be around, well, I'm gonna get in trouble, I do not particularly care to be around New England people because I consider them very arrogant and they look down on us. But everything we said here today, it boils down to one thing. A little plant called cotton. That brought everything to a point where it reached it got as far as it could go. That little beautiful white plant that we all depend on, and because and this brought on slavery because the Southerners had to have some way of getting their these huge crops in. You didn't take your family out there and pick 100 acres of cotton, and this brought on the worst evil our country has ever had, and that is slavery. There's no excuse for there's no way defending slavery. Men are free, and our country, we do as we please pretty well, as long as we don't hurt someone else. And the people who suffered over this is a poor black person. And if you remember, 16% of the Southern soldiers owned slaves. And the people in the North can't believe that. And it comes from their own historians. The National Geographic is the first time I ever read it. But to me, it all boils down to this. We can't blame ourselves as individuals, but we point our finger at a plant that grows and produces what we live in, dress in. But it goes back to me, it goes back to cotton.
I know. I wrote a paper in one of his classes. You know, your graduate class on Civil War. My whole deal is reading that. They call us the Civil War, cotton. But in 1893, all the slavery was going out of the United States, and Eli Whitney and did the cotton gin. All of a sudden, all the slaves, we got to have them back, you know. So slavery just went crazy. And now it's still, or cotton is still doing that. If you notice, there used to be 4 cotton gins in the little town of Matthews, Missouri. Now there's 1. And the reason is, you know, they bale the cotton, a modernization of the cotton crop. If you go out here and you see the round bales in the field, and you'll see big tractor-trailer trucks with flatbed trailers pulling in there and taking that cotton 200 miles away to a gin that runs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And all these cotton gins, and so if you go to schools around here, the School of Malden, if you go to with academic rating, they're 1A now. It used to be a 3A school. Charleston's 1A over there. That's shrunk. The schools have shrunk that much. And as you go, Cape Central has shrunk because people moved to Jackson. But everything from the ridge south, those towns have all shrunk, okay? There's no people living there anymore. Cotton changes everything, okay? Changes population, takes people to war. And so all the war started when guys over in the Fertile Crescent started farming. It wasn't the wandering tribes, nobody tribes that killed things. They started growing wheat and grain, so then they had to fight for land. And that's what started started wars. So cotton just caused it. All the guys in Europe and everywhere wanted that cotton coming out of the South. It's a big money crop. And all of a sudden the North seen all that money going into the South. They said things, you know, and who were the people, Dr. Nickell, that used to, or what they do, they stood their horse cause and all that stuff. That started in the North in Civil War. What do you call them? I'll think in a minute. Which brought on, you know, going to war and everything. You know, it was always the Northern Democrats that favored the South and backed them and going into war and everything. So anyway, I just say cotton was one of the big reasons of the Civil War. You know.
Well, cotton is an important crop, obviously, and it has a bright future. I don't know if you're aware that New Mexico State University is now producing, they have split cotton cells somehow or other, genes, and they're now raising blue cotton and red cotton. So you can have a field of blue cotton, a field of red cotton, and if you have a field of blue cotton, you can make jeans out of it. It'll never fade. So Levi is just waiting for that to happen. Anyhow, thank you all very much for coming. I appreciate it, and I appreciate the invitation.
Thank you very much, and I was
Thank
sitting
you.
back there listening to you thinking, and I thought, you know, if Dr. Nichols had chosen to be a statesman instead of a historian, it might be a little more peaceful today. And I want to give you this book. It's
Well,
not
thank you
much,
very
but
much.
Thank you very
I
much.
think this has got a famous author.
I wouldn't say that.
Blood in the Ozarks, that's good.
And
Thank you so much.
for everybody that came out and shared your opinions.
Hey, if anyone wants to go through the museum, we'll stay here with them.
Okay. You want to go through the museum, people will stay here. We are going to have a business meeting, but we are open to the public. So if you want to stick around for our Sons of Confederate business meeting, you can. And if not, then again, thank you from the bottom of our hearts for coming out today and having this dialogue, because I think that's what's missing today is we need to have a dialogue, and there's just not one. Thank you.
I can't believe we're this many people.
Hey, good to have you here.
Good to you all.
Are you still up at,
I work out of St. Louis now.
what?
I work out of St. Louis now.
Oh, you do?
Yeah. I've got all the dry pants and all that stuff.
Oh, okay. I wanted to come there to a dog show. I've never been to a dog show. And I understand they really built a nice place for dogs.
You like that?
You take care of them. Excuse me, sir.
Nice to meet you. In my government newspaper, I just did a free interview.
No, this is just funny, no fights.
Today, so they call me. Well, I do publication. I just write and they all my stuff. That's the way it goes. Anyway, this is do you have
I'm
a
very disappointed. There's no fight.
Well, I don't know.
I look forward to
They will all happen outside.
Oh, are they there? I'll go send this.
Hey, how you doing today?
Pretty good.
Glad you came out. Where are you from?
I was going to give the train presentation here about 9 months ago, if you remember.
I'm sorry, I don't hear well. You're
Well, my name's Sean Frederick. I came to do the train, presentation on the trains, history trains here.
Oh, okay.
I'm Clint's friend, so.
Okay, we're glad to have you.
Is this a national organization?
Yeah.
Do you have a place online where you talk
Glad
about
to have
this?
you.
Where is it?
Science Center.
I used to have, I was in the Department of History, I'm retired now, and I work full-time for the Keller Foundation.
People are coming down 25.
Be happy to talk to you.
You said it's a national organization? Do you have a website? Is there a website?
We don't have a,
Is it the
well, we
one
do
they
have
passed
a
out?
website.
Okay.
Cumberland Foundation, but we just started
And
here.
let me see, who did I?
Hey, can I have
Yes, sir. Get you on.
Is your address on there?
Call us anytime. It's a historic preservation foundation.
Also, Scott County Historical Society, Benton, and I wonder if we could have you up
I need
there.
spines. Ian Spines, I live in Dexter. I do freelance writing to do.
Okay.
Well,
I'll be happy to.
Mind if I
what I
use
think we should do is if we have him come, we have him speak for both groups at once, and he only has to make one trip.
That'll be fine, yeah.
Alrighty,
And let's see, the phone number's on there.
alrighty,
structure? Who are you?
Oh, no, my cell phone, the bottom.
okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Always good talk. You know, I heard a guy
Phone
on
number and email.
phone that told me.
Okay, thank you very much.
He writes
Oh,
books
thank
on
you,
people.
thank you.
Always enjoy Frank.
Oh, yeah. Very popular man.
General Lee's father.
Yes.
And he's more, actually, did more in the Revolutionary War, is more of a hero than Robert E. Lee. He was yeah, he fought in Washington. Yeah, but he ended up,
Oh, okay, well,
you know, he lost all his money. So he had to have a lot of money.
How are you doing?
I'm doing good, good to see you.
Good to see you.
years older than my husband.
You're still keeping busy, I guess.
Yeah, staying busy.
66.
That guy was, he always was big.
Dr. Nickell.
Yeah, with the beard, yeah. Talks real southern.
Always there.
Oh, that's right. Okay. Okay. Well, he, like I said, he was young, he graduated in 1970.
He'll actually be out caving with Scott House.
Oh, you will?
Kenny Lawrence was in his class. Did you know Kenny?
He's got it down, plastic Paul Johnson.
I can help you anytime.
But I know, well, nice to meet you, this gentleman that was sitting here with.
Somebody.
Yeah, who was he? You think he'll care for
Who
you?
shall not be
We're also been
named.
Did he
told
leave?
that it passed and the roof and the floor, so we got new everything out.
Good to see you.
Could I was been trying to call you, and I still want to call you, but let me tell you what I want to call you about. One, Frank giving that program sometime in 2020.
Oh,
Happy to.
I met his son.
Well, you might.
They were doing an auction.
The other one is, I really want to talk with you about, you know, the Stoddard County now,
Is he a member too?
Facebook programs.
Is he an officer?
Yeah, and I didn't know, we ought to consider that.
Got a fence in the backyard.
The only meeting that I've seen
They need to,
is, one of,
they
Okay,
need to run.
all right,
first
well,
one
that's
was,
okay. That's fine, it's nice to meet you, thank you.
Oh, they're
the
creative.
big time, Civil War guy.
Alexandria.
Gave a call a couple times ago. He had,
Alexandria had,
oh,
he
like
got
30
people
people here.
Jeremy had a good
Go
turnout,
to the
huh?
boy, watch me in the other room.
I was here,
He was right there,
hey, I was here,
grab his hand with
we
her
had
mouth,
10 people.
march in right over and sit you down on the
Seven.
couch. Sometime he's gonna get back up, you back down.
We are thinking about it, and it's pretty simple because Laura there, she had her iPhone.
Jack Russell,
We might
he
get,
took
but
all
anyway,
the potty training.
the only problem is I'm
Once it
concerned
took,
whether,
I mean,
what our
she'll come
intent
up to you
is
every 2 hours.
with, the society anyway, because it's gonna, few people will come. If they sit home, with only 10 people here, I don't know what to do. I mean, it's something we have to have a whole membership. I mean, I think the best would be minimal.
Yeah, I did.
We've got a lot of members
Yeah,
that
we're
don't get our
30,
program,
yeah.
that are, I think about 85, something, we have like 20.
I didn't count myself.
They're not there, but
I didn't count Dr. Nickell, I didn't count Laura, so I
bring
counted
that up.
30.
Next meeting is like
So
7th
that's, I
of
didn't
March.
count Josh, so.
We're not gonna have it.
34, 35. Good turnout.
It's always been bad.
Good turnout.
And,
See ya.
And now you go, are you gonna be in the program with Mark?
I had not planned for it. Actually, John Fisher was.
Oh, John is, okay.
You know, let me try that again. I just had one thing happen. I mean, in December, I had a cryptocurrency up at Cape, which I had several last year. And like, about a week ago, I had a 4-day, kidney stone class. And now my baby,
Get old.
She's had this or that, she's had an acute diverticulitis, and it's just, we thought she was gonna have surgery. It's just been one thing after another.
I kinda had to talk.
You and your dad want to share his opinion?
And I got to thinking, maybe if I had, the microphone where I didn't talk so loud, that I could talk longer, I don't talk very long, I'm just a horse, I can't, and I've seen an E and an E.
I don't understand.